Welcome to the 15th video in the Marine Invertebrate Biology course. We're following on with the phylum Annelida, class Polychaeta, and if you remember, we said they do pretty much everything in terms of reproduction and feeding, lots of different strategies. We're going to go through some of the species and feeding methods with polychaetes. We're going to start with hunting carnivores. So carnivores. And able to help them do that, they've got several pairs of eyes, as much as 4 on each side, so they get 8 eyes. And you don't think of worms as having big jaws, but we'll have a look at some pretty amazing jaws. They crawl around the bottom, live under rocks or burrows, and they can capture or break up prey with their jaws, or they may act like a spider, sucking out the vital fluids of their prey. So, in case there's any wonder about whether these things are amazing predators, here's one, again, with these little urticating hairs that are poisonous as a defense mechanism of the setae, but this one's captured and is eating a fish, which is bigger than itself. Here is a nice picture of the peristomium, that is the prostomium, and here is the peristomium. This whole thing right here is called the pharynx, with the jaws on the tip. And in this species, this is what the head would look like normally. But then when it goes to bite something, and I'll put a link to videos on that show this, that jaw will actually come shooting out of the mouth and shoot quite a long ways out in order to grab prey that's at a little bit of a distance. You can see the antenna and the palps, these are like feelers. They're tentacles. Here are the antenna. Okay, they both serve a sensory function. In this one, you can see the eye spots, parapodia and setae shown, the segments. Okay, the peristomium, prostomium, and then the rest of the body is just pretty much repeating segments that all look exactly the same except for the size of them, and then the last segment, which has the anus. But other than that, this is a very standard hunting predator. Okay, so in case you were wondering about the jaws of these things, they're pretty incredible. You'd hate to be a tiny little thing. It's good to be big and on the top of the food chain like we are, but you can see the different jaws. These ones everted out of this head that comes shooting out of the body that can attack the prey. Here's another one called a bobbit worm, and I'll put a link to on YouTube about the bobbit worm catching octopuses and other things. It's amazing. Here are some polychaete worm jaws. You can see some of the variety in terms of how they go about catching prey with these big fangs, for instance, or ones that are more for grabbing and holding on. Okay. That was predation. Now we look at deposit feeding. So we know what these whale sharks do. Basking shark, this is actually. They just swim along with their mouth wide open, gulping up anything that swims in and catching it on their gill rakers as they come through. That's not too dissimilar in deposit feeding in polychaetes. These are burrowing worms, and what they will do is they'll ingest sediment. So they just burrow through, ingesting the sediment, and if this is a particle of sediment, we'll change our color here. On the outside of the sediment, there will be a little film, a biofilm of growing bacteria and what would you call it? Maybe microalgae and the like. And so what they do is they digest out all of the particulate or the film off of the surface of these particles and then poo out the particles again. So they have to eat massive amounts of material because most of what they're eating is actually not digestible, just little grains of sand and the like. And this is called deposit feeding. So they could be non-selective deposit feeders, which eat really any old dirt, okay? And they don't select any size, any particular grain of size or grain size of the sediment. They could live in burrows and do this, or they could they burrow through the sediment and just eat whatever they eat that becomes pooed out and fills up the hole behind them. Again, also adding to turnover of the sediment and the organic material within that sediment, releasing the nutrients for other types of organisms. This is an interesting picture. A lot of the subsurface annelids that live in small grain particle size, the anoxic layer, where there isn't much oxygen left after bacterial activity has stripped it. They have to have very highly vascularized gills and big gill structures in order to be able to retrieve enough oxygen to be able to carry on their metabolic activity. So we see big gills we tend to see big gills in subsurface annelids, especially the deposit feeders. There are some things that are called non-selective deposit feeders, and if we think about the amount of surface area to volume, we've talked about this a few times, and they have different particle sizes, and we grow the bacterial film around the outside. If you think about it, these small particles like here, remember that the smaller the particle, the larger the surface area to volume ratio. So what these selective deposit feeders will do is only take the small particles. So they have a way of fluidizing the sediment and then allowing the big particles to fall to the bottom, and then the small particles that are still floating or at least suspended and sink more slowly. Those are the ones they eat, and they get a larger amount of food on with this biofilm compared to bigger particles. So selective deposit feeders tend to figure out a way to eat only the smallest grain size. So they can do that by burrows, or maybe they pick they pick the small grains up off of the surface. And some of them, though, will do this thing called they're spaghetti worms. And what they do is they have these grooved tentacles that sit along the surface and pick up organic material that rains down or that is along that is sitting on the sediment, and pass that with cilia along grooves in the tentacles. We'll often see these when you're diving. You see a lot of the spaghetti filaments sticking out from below a rock or something like that, where they hide away to avoid predation. Here is a picture of what it might look like. So they could be in a burrow, and that burrow might be something that they've made, like this one, where they've stuck a lot of particulate matter together with the saliva, and they then all these tentacles, which are modified from the palps, will go out and individually pick up little particles and bring them back to the mouth to feed on. Interestingly, let's say if you're diving and you touch a tentacle here, just to see what will happen, all the tentacles will withdraw. So you'll see tentacles withdrawing from over here and here and over here. It's really interesting while you're diving. Here you can see the little grains of sand and other bits of rock and shell debris that have been cemented together with saliva to make a burrow. And the interesting thing about these, and what's important in a lot of habitats, is they actually provide a lot of habitat, a lot of structure for other things to grow on. We see the algae and other things growing on top of that burrow, so they can increase the three-dimensionality and provide substrate for other things. A picture of the spaghetti worms tentacles going out. You'll, I'm sure, be familiar with this once you started diving a little bit more. Okay, suspension feeders. So we're moving on from deposit feeding to suspension feeding. We've got fan worms, Christmas tree worms, quite a lot of these around nearshore waters in New Zealand. And they have these things called radioles. They're paired modifications of the palps, covered with cilia to capture, sort, and transport food particles. And they look a lot like gills, but they're not gills. So this is what the radioles will look like. So these things, you can see that's kind of like a spiral, and they're really beautiful. But these things can also, because they're a spiral, they sort of fold up neatly and can be withdrawn. And it's got this thing called an operculum, which is like a little trap door that it can pull down over its burrow. And it's lucky that these things are very good at regeneration because they are often nipped off by fish. So when you go up to a fan worm and you come up close to it with a light cue or a pressure cue from your own body moving, you'll see that it's almost too fast for you to see the withdrawal speed of these things into their burrows. Here's a picture of a fan worm out of its burrow. Again, you can see the segments, and each of the segments has its own little appendages, its parapodia and setae. And these aren't very big parapodia and setae, and they don't need to be because it essentially just uses them for a grip to hold within its burrow or its shell, its little tube that it's created in order to hide away. You can see the radioles here and the feathery structure, which are very good at filter feeding. Here's another picture of fan worm radioles, local one, and here's what it looks like outside the body or outside the burrow. You can see the burrow here, and again, you can see the segments, and there's another segment, and then the parapodia and setae, these little parapodia and setae, and the fan structure. But it is for sure an annelid worm because of the segments. Here is something quite beautiful called a feather duster worm, and I will show you put a link to the video on YouTube. It looks like withdrawn. Some of the parasites and commensalists. This is a scale worm, again, like we saw with its setae, modified setae into these scales, these plates, and this is on a sea cucumber. You can tell this is the bottom of the sea cucumber by the way these tube feet look. We'll learn about that in a phylum Echinodermata. Here's one that is another commensalist. This one it is a hermit crab that's gone into a glass shell. It's been allowed to back into this glass shell. It's a fake shell, so you can sort of see how the hermit crab, its body is goes off, it sort of spirals up the shell. And we also see this this annelid worm that lives in with the hermit crab inside its shell for protection, and then it'll come out and sort of steal pieces of food when the hermit crab is eating. And some of them are even parasites. These very small ones they're hooked. They have little hooked jaws for holding on and sucking the blood out and fluids from lobsters and other polychaetes. Okay, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but this is the last method of feeding that we're going to look at, which is that they can make like a mucus bubble that they blow up out of their mouth, and then things will drift along in the current and just stick to it that are in the water column. And when it's gotten completely coated, they just sort of pull that bubblegum bubble out back into their mouth and chew it up and get all the particulate matter off of that. You'll see these while you're snorkeling around in estuaries and soft sediment. You'll see this little bubble and wonder what it is. That's it for the polychaete and the last of the Annelid videos. We'll have some other links on Moodle for you to check out. See you in the next phylum.